Welcome back to the Chronicles of the King podcast, where we take a deep dive into the life and legacy of Elvis Presley. I'm Megan.
And I'm Tessa, and we are two 20-something Elvis fans dedicated to keeping his legacy alive with a research-based approach.
Whether you're a die-hard Elvis fan or simply curious about a man who changed the course of music and culture, you're in the right place.
We are here to unpack the myths, explore the music, and get to the heart of Elvis's enduring impact.
Every other week, we'll bring you research, untold stories, and fresh perspectives on Elvis's journey. From his humble beginnings to his legendary performances, we're here to shed light on it all.
So settle in for a podcast made with a lot of TLC for the man himself, one story at a time. Okay, guys, welcome back. Today we are going to be talking a little bit about the Smith side of Elvis's family, particularly his aunts, uncles, and a couple of his cousins. So Gladys Smith had a lot of siblings, and we won't be covering all of them, but we are going to touch on a couple who played an larger role in his life and their children who also played a role in Elvis's life. And this is a little quote we have from Larry Geller's biography, If I Can Dream, where he says, "Except for the relatives who lived at or near Graceland or who worked for Elvis, few of his kin came around much. But there were many of them this Christmas. They're all going to come now," Elvis said wearily. "They all want something." Elvis came from a very large extended family, so there was always a relative or someone claiming to be a relative with his hand out. We just thought this was an interesting perspective to offer you guys of how the Smith family played into Elvis's life.
Yes. And as Larry said in this quote, he did come a very large extended family. And so that is definitely why we're not going to be covering all of it. If we did, I feel like we'd be researching for like a month or so.
We were going to be doing more. And as soon as I started to get into it, we were like, oh, we can't. We can't.
Everybody had like 6 kids each. Gladys had, what did we say? Like 7 siblings, I think.
Yeah.
Remembering all of them is too much.
Yes.
So covering them and all of their children would be way too much. Mm-hmm. Many I feel like you don't even know, you've never heard of by reading Elvis books or articles or interviews about Elvis. You wouldn't even know because there's too many. But we're going to start, because we're doing things chronologically. Mm-hmm. We're going to start with Lillian. Now, there's not a lot said about Lillian, except we did find this one quote also from Larry Geller's book, If I Can Dream, where he gives us just a little bit about who Lillian was. And just kind of going back what we discussed about in the maternal side of Elvis's family, Lillian was, she was technically the second born after their first child, Effie, who died very early in life. I don't think she even made it.
She was like, yeah, I think she was like maybe 15 months. I think that's what it was.
Yeah.
But Lillian was Gladys's oldest sister.
And she was born January 2nd, 1906 in Mississippi. And we added this a little bit, just to give you a little bit more. She was married to Charlie J. Mann. And as of the 1950 census, they were still married. There's a little bit, did she get remarried? Did she not? But as of 1950, they were still married. And as for her appearance, there's not a lot of pictures of her. But Larry Geller tells us that she had very similar features to Gladys and that the Smith characteristics were very strong, which were her dark hair and her full round cheeks.
And something else that Larry talks about in his book regarding Lillian, like you said, there wasn't a lot of people talking about Lillian. So in particular, Larry expresses how Elvis was a little bit nervous about what his Aunt Lillian might think of his spiritual studies that he was, he was studying different ideologies with Larry.
Easter religion as well. He was kind of touching on his Jewish roots a little bit.
Right. So Larry says that the main reason Elvis was less than thrilled with seeing some of his family that year was his studies, referring to his spiritual studies.
Yep.
Quote, "He knew what they'd think and was especially wary of his Aunt Lillian, Gladys's eldest sister. Lillian had been particularly close to Elvis's mother and was extremely religious. My aunt's coming over today. Elvis said to me, oh boy, you better get ready because now you're going to see the narrow-mindedness. He expected her to lay the fundamentalist line on him and he wasn't in the mood.
Yeah, so I think it can be said that she was definitely a tough and hard-headed woman. She wasn't really open to seeing other points of views. She kind of knew what she knew and she didn't want to sway from it.
Right. So now we're going to move on a little bit to Lavelle Smith, who was Gladys's older sister. She was also like the rest of the Smith siblings, born in Tupelo. And she had 5 children. And 2 of them we're going to be talking about a little bit more in depth.
Yeah. And again, she had 5 children. It seems like all of Gladys's siblings had 5 or more children. So you can see why this kind of gets a little excessive.
Right. And a lot of Lavelle's children actually died kind of prematurely, which was interesting. As we were reading about the Smith family, we were like, man, there is a lot that happened to them.
Absolutely.
And I believe in Alana Nash's book, Elvis and the Memphis Mafia, she discusses with Billy Smith that they kind of thought there was a curse, like a Smith family curse, because a lot of them died young, including Gladys. So
the 2 that we're mainly going to talk about are Junior and Jean. Now, Junior's full name is Carroll Junior Smith, and he was born in 1932, and he passed away in 1961. And then Jean, his full name is Tommy Eugene Smith. That's where he gets Jean from. And he was born November 28th, 1934, and he died March 2nd, 1999.
And from the beginning of the relationship between like Elvis's family and the Smith side of the family, we can tell that they were really super close. In Jean's book, Elvis's Man Friday, he talks about moving to Memphis shortly after Elvis and his parents moved to Memphis. He says that it was this deep sense of kinship that contributed to my mother and daddy's decision to follow the example set by Aunt Gladys and Uncle Vernon and migrate to Memphis in the fall of 1948. We traveled north from Tupelo to Memphis shortly thereafter. It's just kind of interesting that, you know, Gladys and Vernon kind of set this precedent for the rest of the family to move up there with them.
Definitely. And I think both sides of the family, Smith and Presley, they both kind of followed in the same pattern, the same lifestyle. And also from Jean's book, the quote they have is, my parents had also hired out as laborers on an assortment of low-wage jobs in a work life that began before they were teenagers. And they had tried to make their circumstances better by working as sharecroppers on a 675-acre cotton plantation. We had lived in a house provided by the owner of that cotton plantation. Each family had a garden. We cultivated food and we raised vegetables in the Smith garden. And I feel like that's very similar to kind of how Gladys and Vernon started off. They were just taking whatever low-wage jobs that they could find just so that they could make ends meet, have a better life, provide for their families. And that's exactly what you saw from Jean in his book.
Right. And then moving on a little bit more. So Lavelle's life was really kind of marked with a lot of tragedy. As we said, she had 5 children. The oldest son, Lee Edward Smith, died in 1956 in a boating accident. And then in 1969, her son, Robert, slipped and fell while working at the Precision Tool Company, which is the same company that Vester and Travis, 2 of Elvis's uncles, Elvis and his cousin Jean worked at as well. So there were very few safety protocols then. And Jean says in his book that his brother fell into one of the vats of boiling chemicals and was scalded to death. It's really like horrifying when we read about
it. Really is.
Especially knowing that like Jean and Elvis and like all of his family worked there too. And just like how little safety regulations there were at the time.
I know. And like I said, this is kind of just one of the things that we're going to talk about. The Smith family and me and Tessa talked about this previously. They were plagued by a lot of tragedies throughout their lives. The whole family, not just Elvis, not just Gladys. It was the whole family.
And speaking of tragic, this was honestly one of the most heartbreaking things to learn about a little bit deeper when we were doing the research for this podcast was Lavelle's son, Junior, who was Gene Smith's older brother. So one of Elvis's first cousins. And he was sort of part of the original Memphis Mafia from the very beginning, from the get-go. And he was actually a background character in Jailhouse Rock alongside his brother.
But definitely he was one of those fundamental characters I feel like we don't hear a lot about. And I guess we're going to get into, it's like, it didn't last a whole long time, but I don't know. It's just, he's really interesting to learn about, and hopefully we can bring some light to that right now.
Yeah. And a key facet of Junior was that he served in Korea in the Korean War, and he came back with what they then referred to as shell shock, but what we now know is PTSD. He was very severely traumatized by his time overseas, and he returned home practically disabled, which is what his brother Gene said. And after he returned home from Korea, Elvis hired him on his payroll. One, because he was his cousin, and two, because he wasn't really very likely to find work anywhere else.
Exactly. And so we're talking about what they called back then shell shock. We call it today PTSD. One of the things that they talk about is Junior writing home to his family. And, he was kind of expressing that, he didn't even really want to be there. He wouldn't want to wish this upon anybody else. He said that he hoped his brother Robert, so that's Gene and Junior's other brother, he was hoping that he didn't pass his induction for the Army because, quote, he would hate for two of us to get messed up in this.
That's so sad that he's overseas and serving and thinking about his own brother and hoping his brother doesn't pass his induction physical because he didn't want his brother to experience the atrocities that he experienced. I mean, he was clearly suffering. And I feel like that part of him writing about his brother shows that he had a caring personality.
Definitely.
But it was kind of interesting because in Alana Nash's book, Elvis and the Memphis Mafia, she interviews Billy Smith, one of Elvis's other cousins, Lamar Fike, who was a member of the Memphis Mafia, and Marty Lacker, as well as Joe Smith, who was Billy's wife. And they kind of seemed to have a bit of a different opinion on Junior. They didn't feel the same sympathy towards him that perhaps we might feel when reading about him now.
Yeah, there's, based off the accounts that we've read about Junior, there's always, I think there's two sides of the coin, and probably because of what he did experience in the Korean War. But some are saying that he was always looking like he was about to do something painful to you. So kind of saying that he had a bit of a violent side based off of what he had seen in Korea. He was always sullen, but on the flip side, he had a solemn type of humor. So there's always both sides.
Right. And Billy talks a little bit about how both Elvis and Vernon were, quote, crazy about Junior, and that Elvis really was adamant about wanting Junior around, and kind of said that Junior was as soft-hearted as could be, but when he got to drinking, he might hurt you and not realize what he was doing. So we kind of see a little bit of that drinking coming back and making a return theme, as it did with some of the other characters in Elvis's family that we've talked about so far, like Gladys and her father. And
and just kind of to reiterate this and just show this wasn't just one person's account. George Klein, he was a disc jockey, but he was also a very close friend of Elvis. He traveled a lot with them in the early days. And when he talks about Junior, he says, Junior was an honorary guy who was fighting off some demons, kind of referring back to the PTSD, and said he served in the Korean War, had come home with what they used to call shell shock, and was now a heavy drinker and a chain smoker who had trouble holding down a job. When he was drunk, he was mean and belligerent. But when sober, he was a pretty sharp and funny guy, which probably can explain why Elvis and Vernon were so crazy about him, always appreciate, I guess, a guy with a sense of humor around them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But, we kind of get this sense that maybe he was fighting some of these inner demons. But Lamar Fike kind of just suggests that he thought Junior was trying to kill him and was like hatching a plot to try and murder him. Which I think from these other accounts, when we get the impression from George and an impression from Billy of what Junior was like, it doesn't seem that, even when Billy says he might hurt you but not realize what he was doing. It doesn't seem like Junior was particularly with it, or that he had like specific vengeance for violence or anything like that.
No.
So I just thought it was interesting. Lamar was like, he was trying to kill me for sure.
Yeah. And I find the most surprising one was from Lamar. The quote is, "I'm going to tell you something. If anybody was ever a killer, it was Junior Smith."
Right. Like, I think that he had to do some things in the war that he didn't want to have to do, and came back very traumatized from the experience. I don't know that he wanted to kill someone who was Elvis's friend. Like, maybe he reacted to a loud sound or something, and then Lamar was like, "Oh, you tried to kill me." I don't know. It's interesting, the misunderstanding of PTSD that I feel like was so prevalent then. And then we see George like kind of has a nicer, more
more modern
modern take on it. Right. Exactly.
And so we're talking all about all these sad things, and then they kind of all come to a conclusion eventually.
Right. So Junior worked for Elvis until 1958 when Elvis left for the Army. And Billy Smith says that after that, quote, Junior just stayed drunk.
And so, I mean, that's also kind of relaying the part of Elvis gave him a job because he could hold down the job. But continuing talking about kind of like this sad end, our next quote says, he was not in full possession of all his faculties towards the end of life. So I think at this point, once Elvis had gone into the Army, the PTSD, again, what we're calling now PTSD, kind of really just took over him. He didn't know what to do. He just wasn't in his right mind.
And Gene also says of his brother that the night that he died, he had been awake for 2 days and 2 nights, talking to Uncle Travis and trying to sort out all that had happened to him since he returned from the war. And then eventually Junior died in 1961, and he was just 28 years old.
And this, I feel like this event, I always remember hearing that it kind of really took an effect on Elvis.
Absolutely. Alana Nash says that he took a lot of the blame on him. Elvis took a lot of the blame on himself for like not being able to be there for Junior in the way that he had wanted to be. He kind of looked at those Smith cousins as if they were brothers to him. And Gene says that Elvis was deeply hurt by Junior's death. As you can imagine, it was in 1961, Elvis has just come home from the Army. He's resettling into like civilian life, but not regular civilian life. He's going and filming movies and
3 years
stuff.
Prior, he had just lost his mother. So now to lose a cousin that you thought of as almost like a sibling, it's definitely going to take a toll on you, especially somebody who will go on tour with him, go to the movie sets. And they spent a lot of time together over those years.
At the very beginning of his career, Junior and Gene were like really pivotal to creating that atmosphere of like the Memphis Mafia as we now know it, of this entourage of Elvis's friends and family who were around him. They were like the OGs. They were the very first ones who kind of got to experience that.
So maybe we'll pivot a little bit. I guess we're on to a positive note, talking now about Gene Smith. And Gene is, like we said, he's the author of Elvis's Guy Friday.
Elvis's Man Friday, yeah.
Elvis's Man Friday, yes. Which definitely, whereas we got a lot of information from that book. So if you have the time, it's a good read. Take it. You'll enjoy it.
Right. So out of all of Elvis's cousins, Gene was the one who was closest in age to him. He was only 7 weeks older than Elvis. And so they grew up playing together. They were really close, raised kind of as brothers, both because Gladys and his mother, Lavelle, were really close in this Smith family way that we see, but also because their boys were very similar in age.
Yeah, and just kind of give you, I guess, a little background on Gene. One of the things that we learned about his childhood was that Gene actually suffered from polio and had to have his right leg in a cast because of it. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know a whole lot about polio. I don't know, Tessa, if you did any research about polio.
Not a whole lot, but I mean, it was something that kind of left him a little bit, like later in his book, he talks about how like he couldn't really run in the way that he had been able to before. I think he was like 8 years old. Gene was 8 years old when he had polio. But also it's interesting if you just think about how Elvis later on very publicly took the polio vaccine. I'm hypothesizing that he would have to think, that his cousin had that. But I'm hypothesizing that maybe he did it as an act of solidarity. I don't know, but I
mean, it probably had to come up, be like, you know what, my cousin had polio.
Right. And I mean, in the 50s and before that, it was so common. And now it's all but eradicated. Thank you, vaccines.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that. Now we don't have to worry. Well, hopefully we don't have to worry about it. There's always the chances. Let's not jinx ourselves here.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, we can't do that. But talking a little bit more about Gene's childhood, another thing that he did was he helped so we talked about Lavelle, that they were sharecroppers. So Gene he helped his parents hoeing cotton. That was, I guess, a childhood chore he had.
Yeah, was helping his parents. And he never became very educated. And a lot of that was because there was a lot of financial instability in the household. And so he had to work from a pretty young age. But a little bit about Elvis and Gene's bond. As we said, they were really close in age. They grew up almost like brothers. And there's just a sweet little story that Gene tells in his book about playing. He says, we played together more often than not. And we fashioned toy cars from articles the grown-ups had thrown away, like discarded thread spools or empty snuff bottles. We would crawl up under the house, whether it was underneath one of the many houses Aunt Gladys and Uncle Vernon had rented, or underneath my folks' house. And there, out of sight of the grown-ups, Elvis and I would scrape out little racetracks that wound through the dirt, and around the little hills and mountains we had scooped up for an obstacle course littered with challenges. I just really like that story because
Gene is really cute.
Gene drove Elvis a lot, especially in the early days of Elvis's career. Like he was like his kind of main driver when they were on the road and touring in those first couple of years. So it was kind of a little foreshadow moment of them making these little toy cars, but also that they were so thrifty and like used these discarded materials to make toys.
I'm just wondering if that snuff box was from Minnie Mae, though.
Oh, yeah, probably.
It probably was, you know.
She loved her snuff.
Yes. I don't know. And that's just a really cute story.
Right.
Another thing that they used to do, though, as children is that they kind of had their own little secret language with one another.
Not just as children. They did it like...
Yeah. Elvis, I feel like he was always, you know, people hear about the baby talk, but I feel like you don't hear a lot about their little language that they had. And they said it was sort of like a pig Latin kind of situation. Wherein they were saying different words, saying different sentences backwards. Gene says Elvis came to realize that he was being watched like a hawk with various persons hanging on every word. So Elvis and I kept our secret way of speaking to each other so that he could say what he really thought or really felt.
Right.
And interesting.
And it shows how important it was to him to have those people who were close to him around him and people that he trusted around him. And at the beginning of his career, he really did trust Gene. And they were really close. There's so many pictures of them on movie sets. And they actually had a blood brothers ritual after watching a movie where in a cowboy movie, Gene tells us how there was a blood brothers ritual. And so we're kind of like cut yourself and then you touch blood or whatever. And he tells a story of how he and Elvis did that and like cut themselves with their pocket knives and rubbed their blood together when they were teenagers, and that they became blood brothers. So they were super close. I mean, it is.
Yeah, I guess for, Elvis growing up as an only child, it was really important for him to have these cousins that were closer in age to him that he could have this bond with. And like says, even though he didn't have like a biological sibling, I feel like they were definitely that fill-in and they filled that gap for him.
Absolutely. So as we talked about a little bit earlier, we were talking about Gene and his family moved to Memphis really shortly after the Presleys did. But Gene actually did not go to high school with Elvis. Like I said, he wasn't very educated. He didn't go to grade school like he should have. He was behind. And he thought, he and Elvis were supposed to be in the same grade, but Gene dropped out. But of that, he says that, quote, he learned more in my 10 years on the road with Elvis than I would have in 10 years of formal schooling. And he kind of argues that anyway, if we were learning about culture and higher education, we couldn't do it without talking about Elvis. So like, who would know it better than me? Exactly. I just think it's interesting when compared to how Gladys walked Elvis to school every day to kind of make sure he kept his education and didn't follow the same fate. I thought it was interesting that like Lavelle, she had other stuff going on. Maybe she didn't. She was like, I can't deal with this. Like, it's fine.
That is a really good point to make. It's the different priorities, even though like Lavelle and Gladys had the same kind of upbringing, that their priorities were just a little bit different.
Also, she had 5 kids. And I mean,
true. Yeah. Usually I feel like the stereotype is that when you're like the only child, you like kind of almost have like a helicopter parent, I guess, where all the attention is put on you. Whereas like you have 5 children, you have to like spread it out a little bit.
Right. And Gene was one of the younger ones. So probably by that point, they're like, whatever.
It's the thing about being the youngest, I guess.
Right. But Gene and Elvis, actually, I found this so interesting. They bonded over a love of fashion and working on improving their appearances when they were in Memphis, when they were early teenagers.
Yeah, so we love a good fashion moment. They're saying when they were together alongside with Johnny Smith, Travis Smith, and Elvis Presley at Precision Tools, Elvis and Gene both had long hair at the time and were threatened with a manly haircut by some other people who worked there, which sounds very similar to the guys that Elvis met in the bathroom at Hume's High who threatened to cut his hair.
Right. So Gene says that when they were there, they were kind of, Elvis and he were defended by their family, by their uncle, and sort of were watched out. But Gene says they got fired for having long hair. I don't know about all that, but
I mean,
it's kind of,
you never know.
Something else in terms of the fashion, this is what Gene says, that with Elvis, they discovered Lansky Brothers, which, if you don't know, is a very famous clothing store in Memphis, which is and was on Beale Street. So
place for all the hot and snappy dressers.
Hot and snappy dressers and unusual clothing for the time. If you've seen the Elvis movie, you have seen the scene where he's looking in and sees B.B. King. And it was a very important part of Elvis developing his persona and
his image.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, you always think about like them talking about Elvis in high school and saying, this was the kid who had the sideburns, the ducktails, never wore jeans. He always wore the black pants with the pink stripes. But again, back to the hair, Gene and Elvis, they always got their hair cut together, it seems like.
And this was just really interesting. Gene says people thought that Elvis didn't cut his hair ever. But he tells a story and he says, quote, Elvis did get his hair cut at a barbershop on a regular basis, a Black-owned, Black-operated barbershop located next to Princess Theater on the corner of Main and Beale Streets. Elvis and I both got our hair cut there, or trimmed. So they never got the crew cut. That was very fashionable at the time.
Always, we had to have those ducktails, long hair. It's what made the look.
Absolutely.
So, and yeah, but no, they were always hanging out together. And Jean even tells us more often than not, I would go to the dairy bar and mix a purple cow, which for anybody who's interested is vanilla ice cream with, I apologize for this pronunciation. Is it New Grape?
I think it's New Grape. Yeah.
New Grape. We're going with it. New Grape soda for Elvis and myself before we held our conferences and swapped complaints about the direction our lives had taken. So they were definitely, I feel like, gossip buddies as well.
Buddies, and they were both working at Precision Tools, which is like so tragic that later then Jean's brother passes away there. But Elvis was in school or just out of school and kind of looking for a new direction. He wanted to become a singer, but Jean was still working at Precision Tool, but they maintained a close bond. They actually went, there's a picture of them with their prom date. So when Elvis went with Dixie Locke, who was his first girlfriend, to her prom, there's a picture of them and also a picture with Jean in it. And the four of them are together with their prom dates. It's quite cute.
I'm telling you, it's so cool. They were always doing everything together, it seems like.
In the early years, yes. Absolutely.
In the early years, yes. And so just talked about Elvis and Jean together, but maybe like the point of this is kind of letting you know who they were as a person too. So talking about Jean's character now, this is from Elvis and the Memphis Mafia. So Marty Lacker says Jean was crazy, but made Elvis laugh. In high school, Jean was the closest thing Elvis had to a brother. Elvis would have given Jean anything he wanted. Again, I just talking about them, they were like brothers, not cousins. And you can tell, I feel like the kind of people Elvis loved to have around were the kind of people who made him laugh and just brought joy to his day.
And also people that he felt were, were going to stick by him.
Yeah, the loyalty.
Yeah. It's interesting because when we read a little bit more about it, the Memphis Mafia kind of regarded Jean as not that smart. And they did think he was funny. But George Klein in his book says that Jean wasn't what you call book smart, but he was funny, easygoing, and one of a kind characters Elvis always seemed to enjoy. Most important, he was as loyal as could be to Elvis, who he called Cuz. I feel like that relationship was so important at the beginning of his career. And some of these Memphis Mafia guys could be so mean about their characterization.
There's always mixed reactions about, there's I feel like almost like there's cliques within the Memphis Mafia. Like some of these guys got along, some of them didn't get along. They always talked bad about one person. They always liked the one guy. From that description from George, it seems like, he was a nice guy. He wasn't the brightest, but he was funny and kind. But Marty Lacker was he was dumb. And Lamar characterizes him in the same way that he did characterize Junior. And he told Alana Nash in the Elvis and the Memphis Mafia book that Jean was capable of, quote, slipping a blade in your ribs if he felt like it. Lamar, maybe you're a pessimist, baby. And I was going to say, I feel like to George's credit, I think he really tries to he's even about it. He's like, well, this was the bad qualities, that were the good qualities. He's very fair about everything. Kudos to George, and that's why I love George. Gives us both the good and the bad. And whereas we're getting he was gonna slip a blade into your ribs.
Maybe Lamar was just paranoid because maybe he thought everyone was gonna kill him. So,
and we're going to have to look into this when we cover the Memphis.
Yeah. Once, that is going to be a whole thing.
That's going to be, each one's going to have their own episode. Connections within. Yeah. We're going to do it.
Absolutely.
So one of Jean's roles within the whole Elvis world was he wasn't just Elvis's, kind of go-to guy, I guess, almost like his brother, but he always joined Elvis on the road. And Jean was one of the first members of Elvis's entourage. So we're talking about the OG Memphis Mafia. And as Tessa said, he was Elvis's driver in the beginning. That was kind of his first role.
Right. And then another role that he took on was kind of in part due to Gladys, so Elvis's mother, being really concerned for Elvis's well-being and knowing that Elvis and his father, that they both sleepwalked. They were sleepwalkers.
Sleepwalkers. There we go.
And So Gene was given by Gladys the responsibility of looking out for Elvis at night, because she always worried. There were several instances where he had like left the apartment and like
wandered out into the
hallway, like on the roof, in the street, like,
yeah,
because he was sleepwalking, and something similar had happened with Vernon. So she was really worried that Elvis would injure himself when he was on tour. So Gene says that, quote, I was sleeping with one eye open. And he stayed up at night out in Hollywood, always keeping watch over Elvis.
Yeah, and talking more about like the whole like sleepwalking situation, Billy Smith said, and this is also from Elvis and the Memphis Mafia, when Elvis was making Loving You, he always walked on the 11th floor of the Beverly Wilshire. The window was open and Gene caught him just in time.
Right, like that's kind of scary.
That is a little scary, but you know, Gene was quick with it. He was like, maybe you can say that he was like one of the first bodyguards, like a nocturnal bodyguard, I guess you could say.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And also Gene was one of these guys who played a lot of pranks with Elvis. They tried to play pranks on the Colonel all the time. So Elvis and Gene would conspire with like a fake gun and make it seem like Gene was mad about something and that he was trying to kill Elvis. And
you can't do that to the Colonel's number one asset.
Well, and then the Colonel also was like, dude, I'm like, you're going to give me a heart attack. And all the guys were like, you're going to give him a heart attack. And
Don't do that.
So this happened a couple times. And at first the Colonel like really believed it and was like, what the hell is going on? And didn't know how to deal with it. And then Elvis and Gene just like break out into laughter because it's so funny, I suppose. But destroyed a lot of hotel rooms. Yeah. A lot of hotel rooms were destroyed. There were a lot of pranks, a lot of shenanigans. They got kicked out of hotels. I mean, some useful hijinks.
Yes, some useful hijinks. But with the hijinks, there comes a couple of incidences. And one of those happened in 1962 with some pills. So Gene went back to working with Elvis in 1962. And he had taken a few years off to care for his family. And yeah, once he joined back on, bit of an incident.
Right. So this incident is something that has been written about. And so we tried to get several different sides of what happened to get the idea of what happened. So it's 1962. In the Elvis and the Memphis Mafia book, Billy talks a little bit about it and says that on a long drive from Memphis to California, Gene had, this is what Billy refers to them as, go-go pills, which were dexedrine amphetamines. And, quote, he was trying to fix everything on the bus, even stuff that didn't need fixing. And then Billy says that in a reaction to that, Elvis was just like, you're driving me crazy, because he was now driving it was like a motorhome. He gave Gene 500 milligrams of Demerol to bring him down from how hyper he was and like get him to sleep. But half an hour later, Billy says, quote, Gene was still wide awake, so Elvis gave him another 500 milligrams and told him to lie down. Then after that, Billy checked on Gene, and Gene was like not super reactive in the back of the bus. And Billy had been the one to find Junior dead. So he was like, talk about traumatized, this whole family.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Right. So he was worried that Gene was dead, but he wasn't dead. He had a bad reaction, obviously, to mixing an upper and a downer. But apparently Elvis dragged him out of the motorhome and walked him alongside the highway for a while to make sure he was all right.
That's a good cousin would do.
Right. But Gene kind of softens the blow of this incident.
Okay. So we're talking about those sleeping pills. Gene said that he took the sleeping pills but still could not sleep. So he asked Elvis, "Our next one go to sleep?" So kind of, I guess, saying like he's a little bit responsible, it seems like.
He is not mentioning anything about the amphetamines that were.
Yeah.
Which, like, I understand if you're telling your own story. So it was just interesting that that part was totally not mentioned when Gene was talking about the incident.
He's kind of being covered up a little bit.
Right. But Billy was like, oh, yeah, he was taking amphetamines and like being annoying. And that's why he had a sleeping pill anyway.
And so in Elvis's Man Friday, the quote we have is, Elvis sent Billy Smith back to the rear of the van to wake me. Elvis dragged me up and down the road in sub-freezing weather. So left that part out, but Jean definitely recalls the sub-freezing weather. If it hadn't been for Elvis, I would have probably died.
I feel like this is a really contentious event in the Elvis history. I know in this Elvis of the Memphis Mafia book, I feel like maybe there's a spin trying to say that Elvis, drugged his cousin basically, which, he thought he knew everything about all of these medications, but he wasn't a doctor. I don't know. I mean, we can't really make a full decision on that, but it feels like it's a complicated situation. And so
definitely, I don't feel like there was intent behind it.
Right. It was more like he's annoying me and this is known to calm people down and he needs to go to sleep because he'd been awake for hours. Mm-hmm. But it's kind of sometimes I feel like there's the way it's told gives a different perspective on it and sort of suggests that Elvis was drugging him up. I mean, we're not making a final decision on it. These are the two kind of accounts of what happened, but it's just interesting to think about different ways that this particular story is told. I mean, Gene himself doesn't seem to be too mad about it, but Billy Smith was kind of a little bit more real with that. There were some other substances involved. So moving on a little bit, do you want to tell us a little bit about what happened between Elvis and Gene and why later on they were not as close as they had been in the beginning of Elvis's career?
So I don't know. I love reading Elvis books, and you always kind of hear talk about Gene in the early days, but then you kind of read towards this end of the 60s, the 70s. You really don't hear a whole lot about him. So, from Elvis and the Memphis Mafia, also another good book. If you have time, take a read.
It's so long.
Good. It's a long book, but I think you'll get a lot of information. Yes.
Yeah.
So Marty Lacker in the book says in late 1962, Gene and Elvis had a misunderstanding about some missing jewelry. And Elvis said he didn't ever want to see Gene again. Every once in a while, Gene would come up to Graceland, but every time he came up, he wanted something. And Elvis was always hurt.
Right. So Gene doesn't talk about this at all. He doesn't say that there was any incident for missing jewelry. For other things that I'm pretty sure you've read and I've read, and some of you guys might have read too, Elvis liked to test his friends and family because he at the beginning I think he was very trustworthy, trusting, not trustworthy. He trusted other people to a fault. And I think as he started to get a little bit more fame, you can kind of see that he had anxiety about who he could really trust. So he would test people in his inner circle to kind of see who would take the bait of who would take money, who would take jewelry, is there missing jewelry, to see who was really genuine with their care for him. And I guess Marty is sort of saying that there was an incident wherein he was betrayed or, that
Elvis felt like he could no longer trust him or keep him really in that inner circle of what we would call the Memphis Mafia.
Right. And so Marty also adds that Gene would come up to Graceland every so often, not very regularly, but recalls an incident in 1973 where he came up with this fancy motorcycle. And apparently he was whining, quote, that's a quote from Marty's, and asking for Elvis to buy this motorcycle for him. Gene says it's a little different. He doesn't mess with any of this stuff.
Yeah. So when we're talking about Gene's kind of side of it, Gene says that the distance of the relationship was because, and we quote, the years intervened in our lives, took separate roads, but I kept up with Elvis as he seemed from a distance to become increasingly desperate. So that's kind of Gene's side of things. Again, some people always tend to be a little bit biased when they're kind of recounting their own side of the story. Right. So that's why we're offering both sides, kind of the onlooking from Marty and then Gene's own take on things.
Gene doesn't like mention any bad blood or anything between them in his book. But it seems that there was definitely some kind of rift, especially with how close they were at the beginning. But apparently consistently Elvis would send Gene and his wife $1,000 every Christmas. And Gene recalls the last time he saw Elvis in early 1977. And he says that Elvis told him, quote, "I am so tired of being Elvis Presley." I mean, we hear this. This is in the Elvis movie. This is in a bunch of other books. Other people have said it too. So, but that's just what Gene says.
But it didn't seem like he might not have been part of the inner circle towards the end, but I feel like there's still that connection and respect between both of them.
Right. And a family bond. Like, that's your family.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And Gene was one of the pallbearers at Elvis's funeral. So there was clearly a family respect there. They were raised almost as brothers, the two of them. But something must have happened in 1962 or around then to kind of disintegrate the relationship a little bit, right?
So that we covered the two important children of Lavelle. We're going to talk a little bit about Travis Smith and his children. So Travis was Gladys's younger brother, and he is the father of Billy Smith.
He, alongside Elvis's father, Vernon, was arrested for forging the check, and he served the 8 months as well as Vernon. But Billy Smith kind of suggests, this is a quote, Billy Smith says, "My daddy told me how they done it. They added the 0 and changed the writing. And Vernon done most of that because my daddy couldn't read or write except to sign his name." So Travis was pretty illiterate. And I just think that was kind of an interesting side. I had never heard that before, that like Vernon was like
that's really interesting.
I don't know.
He was the brains behind the operations.
Right. That's how this made it seem for sure.
Also, I feel like it's interesting to finally like somebody say, "Oh, it was a 0" instead of like the 1.
Right.
So it was always debated, like, did they add the 1 to make it 14 or it's a 0 to make it 40?
Right.
So it's nice to get some kind of more solid evidence.
Yeah.
And so after they forged the check, like you said, that they both served 8 months, they also kind of followed the same footprint as Lavelle. They followed Gladys and Vernon to Memphis. And they kind of lived the same lifestyle. They were sharecropping, which meant
when they very first moved to Memphis, Travis Smith and his kids lived with Elvis and Elvis's family. Alana Nash says that, they all lived in this one house, 370 Washington Street.
Yep.
And apparently, these siblings were super close, so they didn't really mind living together in one house. And something interesting about Travis was that alongside Gene's father and Vester Presley, he was one of the very first gate guards at Graceland. And actually he took this job from when Elvis lived at Audubon Drive. So he was like the OG gate guard. Like when they had to build a wall around Audubon Drive, he was the guy who was like, okay.
I'm gonna troll this wall. It's mine.
Right. I just thought it was interesting that he was, according to his son, like basically illiterate. But that Elvis kept him employed, his whole life basically until he passed away, until Travis passed away.
So then talking maybe a little bit more about his character, this seems to be like a running theme among the Smiths, or something that just Elvis really appreciated. And once he noticed this in you, he kept you close. Again, in Elvis and the Memphis Mafia, Lamar says, "Travis was very funny and benevolent. You just didn't want to cross him, especially when he was drinking." And they all seem to be very funny and have a sense of humor.
Funny, but now we have this drinking again. So Billy says that all my family drank homebrew and vodka and they took pills. But I guess they were all just drinking this moonshine.
It was in that Smith blood, I guess. Bob must have taught them something.
Yeah.
But But Billy also says that Daddy was easygoing. This is a quote, by the way. But he would kill you if he had to, and you couldn't help but like my daddy. He was a whole lot like Aunt Gladys, always ready to do. I'm going to reread that. Billy said Daddy was easygoing, but he would kill you if he had to, and you couldn't help but like my daddy. He was a whole lot like Aunt Gladys, always ready to do anything and everything, but he was also easily persuaded by certain people.
Yeah. And apparently, I just thought this was interesting. JD, so Vernon's father, apparently liked Travis better than Vernon. So I wonder if there was a little tension between these brother-in-laws.
I know. Which is really interesting because there was no, like, other than the marital ties, like this, but we're not talking about like Patsy's father or anything Patsy's mother, were there that connection, which is really weird.
Right. It was like his son-in-law, not even.
Yeah. Like not even. No.
It was like, okay. But okay, so then a little bit about Elvis and Travis's relationship. So Billy Smith recalls that Elvis took his driver's test in his uncle Travis's 1951 Chevrolet that he had bought brand new. And that was the car in which Elvis took his driving test.
Man, to trust a new driver though with a brand new car.
I know. That's funny. And then Travis, like we said, was the gate guard at Audubon Drive. And then he was a gate guard at Graceland.
Yep.
And similar to these other Smiths, he kind of had a sad end of life.
Yes. So after years of abusing alcohol, in 1969, Billy and Travis became bedridden and had a stroke and never spoke again. He lived for 4 years without speaking. And I feel like that's got to be like one of the saddest ways to go, is just not being able to communicate with your loved ones or your friends. And so ultimately in August of 1973, as a result of liver disease, Travis passed away.
And there was some debate at the time of Elvis's death. They were wondering if his liver disease was something hereditary, that, because his mother had hepatitis and passed away from that. And then Travis, it's not clear, but I think that we can kind of see a theme that they were abusing alcohol. A lot of the Smith family, I'm sure, alcoholism ran in their family. And well, it seems that way from the number of people that we're seeing. So I think maybe that was more of the underlying cause.
So now we're going to talk a little bit about Bobby Smith, which I feel like it's not somebody that's ever really talked about. We usually get, we hear about Junior, Gene, and Billy, but we don't really ever hear a whole lot about Bobby.
And he's an interesting character. Also tragic.
Also, well, it just seems like the whole Smith family, there's just always like some kind of tragedy around the corner. It's very sad that this entire family had to go through this over, decades, really.
Right.
But so Bobby Smith, he was born in Tupelo, Mississippi. And along with, just like all the other Smiths, they moved to Memphis with his family at the same time as the Presleys.
Right. So this is Billy's brother. Bobby and Billy are brothers. And Billy quote says that there were 7 of us in that one car, Daddy and Mama, me and my older brother, Bobby, and Gladys, Vernon, and Elvis, and all our belongings. So not only did they move up to Memphis, they were literally in that same Plymouth, car, the green Plymouth, or whatever, going up on the same trip.
And again, always want to talk about somebody's character. It was said that, this is according to Billy, similar to Junior in a way. Bobby was similar to Junior. And they were both a kind of trouble. So kind of, guess, a common theme that you're going to see throughout the Smith family. Another thing that Billy points out is saying that his brother was quick-tempered.
Yeah. So more about Bobby being #troubled, as his brother says. Bobby joined the National Guard shortly after Elvis was in the Army. Kind of, he felt like, oh, well, Elvis is in the Army, like I can do some fan service too. And then Billy says that while his brother Bobby was in the Army, quote, he started thinking of ways to get the hell out. So he swallowed safety pins. He swallowed them closed, but one of them came open and punctured his intestine. So he literally tried to Section 8 his way out of there. He was like, gotta go.
Yeah.
There's little
Which that's going to be kind of a question when you show up to like National Guard doctors. Like, excuse me, sir, but like, how did the safety pins get there?
Yeah, like I don't know.
But no. So aside from the swelling, the safety pins, Bobby was married several times, but Billy says he couldn't hold a job. So kind of similar to Junior in that aspect. I don't know what it was about the military back then that just wasn't, I guess, like we said, there's not the awareness or I guess the support after coming out of the military that these veterans get. So, and he also had trouble staying in relationships, not just holding down a job.
Right. Like his life kind of was one thing after another. It was never really fully settled.
Yeah.
And so now just moving on a little bit to talk about Bobby and Elvis's relationship. Billy says pretty adamantly that Elvis looked after him and Bobby because they were younger than him. And Bobby lived at Graceland with his brother Billy and his parents at the back of the property. And then they spent their first Christmas at Graceland. Apparently it was like, quote, having Santa Claus for a first cousin because Elvis bought them all kinds of stuff. Yeah.
I mean, I would give anything to spend a Christmas at Graceland.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
But I feel like also we talk about earlier on, Larry talking about like, okay, they only showed up for Christmas.
Right.
Which is questionable, I guess.
More about this kind of idea that like maybe they were maybe using Elvis a little bit or using his fame.
Yeah.
In the Elvis and the Memphis Mafia book, Marty Lanker recounts that, quote, Bobby went down to the drugstore and bought a $500 hairbrush and charged it to Elvis's room. And apparently, like, Elvis flipped out at him. Some people were like, oh, he thought it was $5, not $500. And Elvis is like, he knew it's $500 and he charged it. Which I didn't even do the inflation calculator on this one, but that has got to be crazy.
I don't even want to know.
I do not want to know. No. And Billy said that his brother was kind of an example of someone who is fundamentally good becoming not so good because of the result of someone else's success. And that person's success was Elvis.
Yeah. Kind of still talking about maybe like being a grifter, kind of a moocher, I guess, if you want to say.
Yeah.
But they're also saying, in addition to like the $500 hairbrush, Bobby would do things like write back checks. And he went in and out of jail for it. So kind of also, I guess, following in the footsteps of Travis a little bit. He even would sign checks with Elvis's name, according to Billy.
Yep, he would sign the checks like in Elvis's name or write blank checks with Elvis's signature like on them. So he a little bit, it seems, even his own brother says like he took advantage of the situation a little bit.
Yeah.
Interestingly, there was like a crazy incident. In 1961, Bobby got hit by a drunk driver literally right outside Graceland on Highway 51,
which is now Elvis Presley Boulevard.
Right. And Billy kind of says that this accident messed Bobby up even more because he really then was not able to stand properly because it had crushed both of his legs. Like it was a really bad accident. And he says that, you know, that Bobby couldn't really get a job because he couldn't stand. And I don't think that Bobby was employed by Elvis in the same way that these other cousins were.
Which also, to add to that, Tessa does have a photo. I guess they said it's a newspaper clipping, which we will be sharing just to kind of give a visual reference to all of this because those are always interesting.
There's a picture with Travis and Bobby like in the hospital and Elvis is looking down at Bobby like, what the heck is going on here? He looks a little bit disdainful. I don't know if maybe there's some drama there, but
could have been. But no, so we're talking now about, again, always as kind of the Smith family goes, there's always some kind of very sad, tragic event. And so now we're talking about Bobby's death. And this is also from Elvis and the Memphis Mafia. Billy is quoted as saying, on September 13th, 1968, I got a call. Bobby had taken rat poisoning. I got him to drink mineral oil to throw up. And then I said, you need to go to the hospital right now. At first, he refused to go. Finally, we talked him into it. They pumped his stomach and they wanted to keep him overnight, but he wouldn't stay. So he went back home, and sometime during the night, he passed away. He was 27, almost 28. It was so sad, just pitiful. That was a rough time, boy.
So sad. Like,
I know.
Especially like if we think about what was going on in Elvis's life in 1968, like he was about to be back on the up and up. At the time of Bobby's funeral, Elvis was in the middle of filming Charo, and he didn't attend Bobby's funeral, sort of because it seemed from Billy's point of view that Elvis did want to go, but he just wasn't able to with the commitments he had and the contracts he had signed. But later, Elvis expressed regret to Billy that he had never attended the funeral, and kind of was a bit haunted by like Junior's death too. Seeing all these cousins around him pass away so early and from such like tragic circumstances. It must have weighed on him really heavily.
No, and just like I said, it's talking about like you have Gladys's passing, you have Junior, you have Bobby. And why am I missing one?
Who did you say?
We had Gladys's passing, Junior's passing, Bobby's passing.
Oh, and then one Robert, the one who's Robert. So
that's the one I was missing.
Yeah.
It's just like, it's a lot, especially even you have to think like Billy. I think this was a lot for Billy to go through.
Right. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about Billy.
We're going to talk a little bit.
Is Travis Smith's son, and Billy Smith is still alive to this day, which is really cool. He has a pretty active Facebook presence, and him and his wife are still talking about Elvis, and they have an account called Elvis Fans Matter, and they interact with people pretty frequently, which is cool. So
I love hearing their stories. That I definitely encourage everybody. Also, it's another like great resource. It's not a book, but it's firsthand information. So if you have time, just want to listen to something else, definitely check that out.
Right.
So Billy Smith is 8 years younger than Elvis, so they're still pretty close in age. Billy was born in Tupelo in 1943 and moved to Memphis when he was 5. So that we're talking about 1948.
Right, and they lived in that house together. And then Billy moved into a 3-bedroom house in the back of Graceland in 1957 with his parents and his brother. And sort of from then until Elvis passed away, he continued to live in and out of Graceland with his wife, Jo, later on. He lived there, and they were so close to Elvis. Their relationship was really special. And he's, like we said, still alive today, and he lives in Mississippi.
And I feel like if they take questions to us, I feel like also if you have like questions for them, it's like ask them some questions.
Absolutely. So do you want to tell us a little bit about Billy's character and what he was like or is like?
So,
sorry. I'm used to these sad past tense.
I know. We're going to end on a positive note here because we still get to hear from Billy. We still get to listen to his great stories. So this is from Alana Nash's book. Alana Nash says Billy served as a stabilizing factor in Elvis's volatile life and became the singer's confidant in his last days. If ever Elvis Presley had a best friend, it was Billy.
Right. So like where we had Gene at the beginning of Elvis's career, being really close towards the end of his life, he and Billy were really close. And Lamar describes him as, quote, a totally insane kid, but he has something positive to say. He says, quote, of all those Smith cousins, Billy's the only one that came out worth a damn. Elvis felt like he raised him and commended the way that Billy has changed and become a down-to-earth person with a good grasp of things. So although I think Billy, because he was 8 years younger, he was much younger than, some of the other people in the group. So he was probably a child.
He was kind of
found him annoying.
He was growing up with him. I think you talked about the 8-year age difference. You're so he was looking to Elvis as like your older brother.
Right.
He's going to be your role model.
Marty had something negative to say too.
What is up with them? I don't know.
They were in a mood, maybe. I don't know.
Maybe they were.
So Marty describes Billy as, quote, like a pesky mosquito, but said that he had a pretty sharp tongue. So he would fire back some sassy words at them. And Billy kind of agrees. He's like, yeah, I was hot-tempered, rebellious. I didn't like school. He says, because, quote, I thought everyone should love Elvis like I did.
Then Elvis, I guess, thought so too, because Elvis decided to give him the nickname Mighty Mouth.
Mm-hmm.
Because he was often, he was often
retorting.
Just quick with it, giving it back to everybody. Mm-hmm. Again, another, I think, characteristic that Elvis had to appreciate, gonna give him some kind of joy and humor.
Right. And so Lamar said, Billy kind of had a change of character, mostly after he got married to his childhood sweetheart, Joe, who they are still together. And he kind of became a new person, and all the guys loved Joe, but they were kind of like, how did this guy get Joe? Like, she's so pretty and cool and nice. And like, how did this...
You'll have to ask Joe.
Yeah. How did this Billy kid who we've known since he was a kid, get this pretty wife?
Again, we'll have to ask Joe. We'll have to see what reeled her in.
We will.
But so talking a little bit more about Elvis and Billy's relationship, kind of how they work together, what their dynamic was like. Billy says that he was with Elvis damn near as much as I was with my mother and father, really over the years more so. So they almost, I feel like you could say they were almost like joined at the hip. They were together so much.
And like we said before, like because there was that age difference between them, they had a little bit of a different relationship than Elvis had with like Gene, who was much closer in age to him. So Elvis kind of, it feels like from the way that Billy tells the story, treated him like he was a big brother who kind of raised Billy. He took him to the Grand Ole Opry with him in Nashville. And they spent Christmas at Graceland. Like I said, it was like having Santa Claus for a cousin. And after Elvis left the army, Billy and his family moved out from Graceland, but still spent a lot of time around Elvis. And once Billy was finally like old enough, he began to work with Elvis.
Yeah. And in addition, so that working aspect, he would accompany Elvis to California very often. And he was filming, when Elvis was filming movies in the 60s, and like others, he was featured in several of them. So you got to always look out for Billy and kind of spot him in the background, see him as one of the extras.
Yeah.
And one of my favorite stories is when, because there's not any like photographic evidence, there's no video, but it's when the Beatles met Elvis. And Billy was one of those guys that was there in 1965 at 525 Perugia. I always mispronounce it, Perugia Way. So Billy and Joe were both there.
And so it's just kind of cool that Elvis like kept his family around him and close. And we can see that Billy was working with him and another OG of the Memphis Mafia.
Definitely.
And Billy joined Elvis on tour in the 70s. And in a similar way to Gene, he would keep eye over him while he was sleeping, but also they would talk about all kinds of things. About Elvis's life, about the direction he taken, about the emotions he was feeling. They would stay up for hours talking. Both Billy and Joe would spend forever talking to Elvis and kind of like talking him down. And at first, Joe was a little resentful towards Elvis because...
Understandable, I guess.
Understandable because she's like, we have these kids and my husband is off doing whatever with his cousin. Who's, no doubt got all these women around him and everything like that. Like, of course she was...
A little jealousy maybe there.
Right. But eventually Billy and Joe and their sons moved into Graceland in 1974, 75, around there. And Joe talks about getting a little bit closer to Elvis at that point, that she resented him, but then she grew to love him.
Exactly. And I think you want to talking about asking Joe questions. Joe actually said, people asked me, why did Elvis need Billy so badly? He loved him so much that he couldn't be away from him for even 2 days. I really think Elvis wanted Billy with him around the clock. I know he wanted Billy to be out of the trailer the minute he woke up. he called and said is marble eyes up. That's what he called Billy because he had such big eyes on tour. Oh, such big eyes. And on tour, Elvis would say, I don't want anybody but Billy to wake me. I feel like I like marble eyes. I'm sorry.
I know.
It's a good nickname.
He loves
those nicknames. He really does.
Nickname.
But I feel like that shows their bond together. I think there's also more of an importance of Elvis having not just like friends, but family around. The people I think who knew him from the beginning, who he knew they shared that common ancestry that kind of, they grew up the same way. Yeah, they grew up the same way. They understood where everybody came from.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just easier, I think, for Elvis to talk to somebody who had that connection already.
Right. He told Billy that, quote, Elvis told Billy that, quote, a lot of these guys don't understand me. I need you here. And Billy kind of related about their relationship a little bit to Elvis information net, to a reporter. Mm-hmm. And he said to him that, quote, I was always close to Elvis, but I was his family. So kind of heightening that, Smith family bond. Carrying on, several in our group were close to Elvis at one time or another. I was always close to Elvis, even as a young child. He always seemed to want me around him and was very protective of me. I always loved Elvis very much and would do just about anything to please him and be with him. We could talk about anything, and we did. He felt comfortable with me, and he trusted me. When he was sick, I stayed with him. I went to the hospital and stayed with him there. And we were family. He was my hero. So they were so close. It's really interesting.
Yeah, and again, I think it's also like still highlighting that there was something different about being one of Elvis's family members versus just being his friend. I know he was really close to his friends, talking about people like George Klein, Jerry Schilling, but I think there was something special that he held with his family members, whether it was Billy, Gene. There's something special.
Right. And Marty Lacker says too that Elvis's in the last years of Elvis's life, Billy was closer to Elvis than anyone. He was his best friend. So even from an outsider, they could, not an outsider. I mean, Marty was on the inside, but he was not a family member. So he could kind of see that there was something deeper between them, his family bond.
When talking maybe just a little bit about going back to Gene, it was Billy kind of picked up where Gene left off in the role that he played in Elvis's life. So 1962, when Gene kind of exited the circle, Billy entered, and there was that nice transition, I guess you could call it.
Right. That he kind of took over the role that Gene had been doing in the earlier years. But he maintained that until literally the last day of Elvis's life.
Yep.
So Billy was there on the very last night that Elvis was alive, with Elvis's girlfriend or fiance at the time, Ginger Alden. Billy and Joe played a game of doubles racquetball with them. Mm-hmm. And Billy heard Elvis sing for the last time. He was the last person to hear Elvis sing. And he confirmed that Elvis sang Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain. And that was the last song he ever sang. Which when you listen to it, I'm going to put it on the playlist for this week.
Please do.
And it's like eerily foreshadowing. I don't know.
Now, did Billy confirm? I know what they always say that Elvis sang Unchained Melody and Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain. Did Billy confirm both songs?
Yes. And he said, quote, he sang Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain was the last thing. And he was joking and laughing. This is their last interaction, Billy says. We went back up to the house. I went upstairs with him and helped him get ready for bed. He hugged me, said, I love you and good night. This is going to be a great tour, because the next day Elvis was supposed to be leaving for tour. Sadly, as we know, that didn't happen. But yes, I believe he confirmed that those were the last songs that Elvis sang. But it's just so crazy that, he literally was the last person to hear Elvis sing.
It is, just to be in that like small, intimate setting with just those four people.
Right.
I don't know. It's quite the memory to have, I feel like.
Definitely.
But Billy still, I feel like, continued Elvis's legacy and supporting Elvis even after his passing. So after Elvis passed, Billy actually worked as a tour guide at Graceland and helped set up the trophy room But after disagreeing with EPE, Elvis Presley Enterprises, about the way that things were being set up, his former residence, Graceland, Billy was fired.
Yeah, so there was some drama there, apparently. And even more drama was that Billy talks about how after he was fired from working at Graceland, he and Lisa Marie apparently had a strained relationship and didn't have a lot of contact with each other. There wasn't a huge amount of detail about this. And I also felt that maybe we don't necessarily want to pry because it feels very much like family matters.
Certain things I think can be left like private for the family.
Right.
And don't have a whole lot to do with, I feel like, Elvis's legacy, Elvis's life, his career.
Like, we know how sad, like Elvis fans know how sad we are when we think about his passing. I can't even imagine if you were as close to him as Billy was, like how passionate you would feel about it and how, he lived at Graceland, he worked at Graceland, like he grew up there, he had Christmases there. You would definitely...
It's almost like his family home.
Right. You would feel some kind of way about it. And so I kind of understand that, maybe there was some disagreement and he probably felt strongly about certain things the way that I think a lot of us do. But I just thought it was an interesting tidbit.
Yeah, but also it's really interesting. Billy's son, just to add on, Billy's son also has his own YouTube channel where he kind of talks about so Billy, you'll hear him talk about what it was like working for Elvis, being on tour, but his son also has a YouTube channel where he kind of tells about what it was like being a kid at Graceland, and he would play with Lisa Marie there, and they would get into, all kind of trouble. So that's another one to check out as well.
Yep. And so that's kind of, like we said, Billy's still kicking it. He and Joe.
Yes.
Always talk about their time with Elvis. They were super close. We'd love to go more into Billy at some point. I think
I would love to do that.
Oh gosh, this is a long episode.
How many questions? It really was. That's why I said we tried to narrow it down as best we could. Just kind of give you guys like the key figures that we know that you would, you've heard about from books, interviews, magazine articles. So hopefully we did it justice.
Kind of the overall takeaway of this deep dive into the Smith aunts, uncles, cousins. What we really wanted to highlight was that Elvis's Smith side of his family in particular was very close. Gladys was really close to her siblings, and Elvis kind of kept that up by maintaining those relationships with his cousins. They were, and his aunts and uncles. They worked for him. They worked with him. They took him places. He gave them odd ends and jobs. And even if they had some kind of disagreement, like it sounds like there was between him and Jean, he still...
So there was no animosity.
No, like even if he was mad, he still tried to take care of them. He still sent money every Christmas. Like, he felt a certain responsibility to take care of his family. And I think a lot of that has to do with the way that Gladys raised him and the way that Gladys himself was raised and the sort of Smith family values.
There was definitely an importance of family there. You never saw Elvis really disown anybody. You never saw him neglect or shun anybody. Even if his Aunt Lillian was coming up to the house and was going to, lecture him about his spiritual journey, he still had a nice civil conversation and, helped you any way he could.
Right. So we hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about some of these Smiths. I'm sure we'll have more to say about them at a later date.
Yes. They're definitely going to fit somewhere into the Elvis story.
Oh, 100%. So
yeah. So next week we'll be doing the Presley aunts, uncles, and cousins.
And in that we have included Patsy Presley, who is Elvis's double first cousin.
Yes. So she was not on the Smith side, but she will be on the Presley side.
Right. Although she was, it was his technically mother's sister and his father's brother. It was two brothers marrying two sisters. So like 7 brides for some brother.
Exactly.
Interesting. All right, guys.
Bye.
Bye. That's all we have for today. Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Chronicles of the King podcast.
If you love what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. Your feedback helps bring the King's story to life.
You can follow us on social media at the Chronicles of the King for updates, upcoming series, and more. We'd love to hear your input and any of your favorite Elvis moments.
Until next time, keep rocking and rolling, and we'll be back soon with more stories from Elvis's extraordinary life.
With TLC, we'll see you on the next episode of the Chronicles of the King.